Hi there, my name is Victoria Pham, and I am an Australian composer, sound designer, sound installation artist, and sound researcher. At the moment that might sound a little bit confusing as to why there are so many things in that list, but I promise I'm going to walk you through how all four of those elements kind of join together and make a holistic way of thinking creatively and working creatively with sound. So to give you a little bit of background about who I am and where I came from and how this kind of interdisciplinary, multifaceted practice came to be, I grew up in Sydney on Gadigal land. In fact, I grew up in Western Sydney, and that was when I was very young. My parents immediately introduced me into the world of music. And for me, that was through classical music training, specifically learning how to play the piano. And there's one sitting right there behind me to point you to that reference. So I started lessons, I would say maybe I was in my late 3s or early 4s. So I was pretty young. In fact, I remember distinctly in one lesson crying because I couldn't play two notes at the same time because my hand was small. But from this kind of early time, music became a really important part of my life. And it's only now that I'm reflecting back and seeing that it wasn't just the principle and discipline of practicing music every day and learning musical history and theory and all these things that come along with a classical music education, but it's actually the practice of listening itself that was one of the most important fundamentals. So that kind of happened early on. I was taking piano lessons, and slowly through my teens I started experimenting more and improvising more, and I stumbled on things like jazz and different ways of listening in general, like principles of listening, which I'm going to circle back to a little bit later on during this first episode. And then also kind of stumbling into electronic music and improvisation and ways of improvising beyond classical and jazz as a genre. But while this was happening, and also in my early 3s and 4s, I was being sent to Buddhist kind of school, or Buddhist training is probably the wrong word, but kind of workshops. My primary school at the time, Barella Public School, which had an incredible music program that had like Chinese drumming, so I did a bit of that. But as a side to all its music programs, it also had a lot of religious things that were going on, or many options that you could try out or participate in. It was a very multicultural school. For me, that was like the Buddhist workshops. So in my early years, aside from piano, I actually had to participate quite actively in meditation. And back then, I didn't really fully understand it. When you're 3 or 4 and you're being requested to meditate, I actually would quite regularly end this kind of what was supposed to be this very reflective and introspective time falling asleep. And I would wake up at the end of the session with the monk kind of shaking me very lightly to get up and leave the workshop. But again, much like the classical music education that served as a foundation for these different principles that I now look back on, meditation has now kind of reinforced once again the practice of listening. As we move through this month of 4 episodes, the first one that you're listening to now, which is basically me introducing myself to you, the second kind of overgoing in much more detail some of the principles I'm going to introduce to you. And as a little hint, there will be things like listening to historical archives, as well as listening to the environment. And then episode 3 will be kind of a case study, a much more in-depth look into how we can put some creative tools or sonic or even musical tools to use to make work that is about listening to history or historical artifacts and kind of activating that part of our ear. And I like to call that listening backwards. And then in episode 4, we'll be putting the similar kind of tools and a bit of a twist to them. Instead of listening backwards, we'll be listening to the present, how to listen to the now, and particularly my fascination, how do we listen to nature more carefully and more deeply? And I like to kind of phrase that as listening to the now, but also listening for the future. But underneath these kind of series of 4 is a general practice that lots of musicians and perhaps many other previous and current musicians in the Sounds Unheard series have touched on, which is listening deeply. So listening deeply as a general concept or idea or practice or even way of living whether it's through creativity, through making music, all the way to just how you kind of live and breathe through your life. It's something that isn't new age or brand new. As I mentioned earlier, it's something that I unwittingly discovered during my time meditating as a child, but continuing that practice now as an adult. But it's something that's particularly poignant that we reflect upon now. And if you've seen a little bit of music history, or if you're intrigued in looking at a little bit of 20th century music history, you might come across this incredible figure, a musician, an artist, a thinker, that is Pauline Oliveros. And Pauline Oliveros's work, a lot of it was about challenging the kind of traditional norms, particularly found in Western art music and Western classical music, about how we make music together and how we can think about sound as something that isn't just notated, but is more about resonating with the space that we're in. So for example, for me, it's in this room, and listening to the sounds that there's a piece of glass here, for example, kind of considering what is happening outside? How does my body connect to it? Can I hear what is happening outside? And how does that interplay with how I will continue to make music inside this interior space? She also kind of asks us to think about our bodies and how we can breathe together to make music, and how music itself is not limited to or constrained to the instrument. For example, for me, the piano, how do I make music beyond these black and white keys? Or how do I play with the idea of making music the way that I was trained to as a child, with how I'm thinking about the world as a musical object and my body as a musical object. So she's someone that I would highly recommend you all to read and to think about. It's someone whose work has greatly influenced my own. And in fact, I might actually run through a meditation by Pauline Oliveros with you to kind of round out today's first session together and kind of get our heads and our ears and our bodies in the right place to consider these other concepts I'm going to bring into play about listening forwards and now and backwards. But circling back beyond my childhood as a pianist, a not very good pianist, but adequate, and also meditation, running through to how I got to here, combining science and technology, art and music kind of in one kind of hopefully holistic package. By the time I'd finished high school, I realized, music is something I really want to participate in. It's something I want to dedicate my time to and learn more about. And at that time, it was still very much classical piano, because those were kind of the roots that the most of my composition life and listening practice had come from. So I did what every kind of aspiring musician would do, and I auditioned for the Sydney Conservatorium of Music, which I'm very grateful, which is where I ended up studying. So I spent 4 years at the Sydney Conservatorium kind of honing down those more traditional techniques of composition, and that was like writing for acoustic instruments, working closely where I could with those instrumentalists and musicians who are my fellow undergraduate students, all through to learning about orchestration and how that operated as this whole kind of technical thing. But while I was there were these other things happening that I hadn't even considered when I was a high school student, which was music tech. And suddenly, as a composer, I was confronted with having to learn how a microphone worked, how to do a field recording, how to mix sound using electronic software, and music. This lined up with music for film and theatre and other art disciplines, and not just music itself. And those particular subjects were incredibly inspiring for me, because they broke down these boundaries that I didn't even know that I had about what music could be. And suddenly this is the best part of working in the arts or working in any capacity, suddenly I had to collaborate with writers, with poets, with actors, and with dancers and other musicians from completely different genres. And we were making all this different kind of expression of sound and music together. And then I started to understand that my job as a musician was beyond just notating. And that I was much more fascinated by listening to these other artists, how they saw the world, and kind of in a way translating that into music. And for me, I started to unpack this idea of music, again, kind of breaking those traditional boundaries that I had set up for myself, and seeing music as sound, and listening deeply, to the world around me, and kind of hearing the environment, these field recordings that you could take with these microphones, and learning how to transform that into soundscapes and music, and listening to these instrumentalists and the sounds that they made beyond what I thought they could, and some musicians call that extended techniques, and seeing, how could I make music with that? How could I interplay that physical expression of music that this musician is showing me with these electronic kind of soundscape type things that are coming from listening closely to the outside world, or perhaps even something as small as listening to the rhythm of how someone speaks on public transport. So a lot of that early music stuff, which has defined a lot of my practice now as a composer and a sound designer, has come from just realizing, maybe there is music all around us. And then comes in, and hopefully this isn't too confusing, comes in another dimension of my work, which is research. So for me, all the making and creating, that was wonderful. But I had all these questions to ask, and they were slightly bigger, and quite frankly, I'm not going to claim that I've answered them, because in fact, I think through the research, I've probably asked more questions as a result and haven't actually answered the ones I've set out to. But that's all part of the process. I was also, while studying at the Sydney Conservatorium, studying at the University of Sydney in archaeology and art history. So in Australia, it's called a double degree, and they very kindly let you do both simultaneously. So while all this stuff on this side at the conservatory was brewing along, and I was discovering new ways of listening and making music and making art, on this side, it was slightly more sciencey, but a little bit more of an academic delving into listening. And I didn't realize perhaps at the time when I started how closely these two parallels would now come and intertwine into what I'm working with now. So in archaeology, you learn all the principles of human behavior, of the past, how we engage with the past, how when we look at objects, for example, when you go to a museum, what that could mean, what a past human could use with that object. And for me, again, although this kind of training answered a lot of my inquiry about human behavior in the past and what that meant for human art making and thinking and storytelling of the past, it started to spark many more questions. Like, how do we know that that object actually does what the label in the museum says? Can we, if it's an instrument, for example, can we listen through the glass? And how could we listen to the glass? Could we reimagine it? And what are the theories that kind of support our making and our academic understanding of cultural knowledge? So these are really big questions, and I won't answer them in this first episode. In fact, it's just something I'm going to encourage you to listen to at the back of your head, and it's going to come up again later on this month. But yes, so my kind of more academic studies started to, in a way, streamline, as they did in my conservatorium studies, into more deep listening. But it was deep listening about the past. And all the questions that kind of arise about how we might approach that. And I stumbled across this kind of new field called archaeoacoustics, which is all about listening in the past. It's all about using sound technologies to map spaces and map caves and consider how can we use these ancient environments to consider what it was like to listen back then, what it was like to make music back then, and how there is an ongoing relationship with past music to now. And it is from these kind of early questions that my current work in evolutionary biology and evolutionary listening and communication and music kind of stems from. episode where we're going to look at listening to the now and listening to the future, I'm going to introduce you to a few more practical techniques about how you can use these ideas of field recordings and how you can use research in sound and bioacoustics, which is a term I will explain next week, in your own research, and how you might be able to use these techniques of research and sound recording and technology and deep listening into making new work and exploring the world around us with our ears. As I mentioned a bit earlier, I would love to invite you all into a sonic meditation to round out today's first introductory episode. So find a little comfortable seat. As with all forms of meditating, there's no set way to do it. So if you want to do it inside, as I'm about to do, please feel free to do it. You can do it outside. Some people quite enjoy kind of sitting cross-legged and kind of facing upwards into the sky because it encourages the sense of openness. Or really, you can even do this sitting at a desk, which is sometimes what I do when I'm working. It's not going to be very long, but feel free to do this meditation for as long as you require or as long as you need, but I will provide a little 2 to 5 minute excerpt of me kind of guiding you through it, as well as some sounds to support you through this sonic meditation.
Sonic meditation number 8. Environmental dialogue. Each person finds a place to be, either near to or distant from the others, either indoors or out of doors. Begin the meditation by observing your own breathing. As you become aware of sounds from the environment, gradually begin to reinforce the pitch of the sound source. Reinforce these either vocally, mentally, or with an instrument. If you lose touch with the source, simply wait quietly for another. In this instance, reinforce means to strengthen or sustain. If the pitch of the sound source is out of your range, then take this time to reinforce it mentally.
Thank you so much for joining me and giving me some space and time for your day. And I hope that sonic meditation by Pauline has given you a little bit of sonic support and your ears a little bit of a tickling, and as well as sparked perhaps some ideas about where our ears could go across the next coming weeks. I look forward to welcoming you here again to this space through Sounds Unheard, and see you soon.